My presentation is basically going to talk you briefly through my paper, and there are copies here if you haven't got one, or there are some outside the door, but I recommend that you use the paper as I talk, because I've put up a number of the charts onto PowerPoints, and actually they don't fit very well and you won't be able to see them very well. So it'll be better if you can use the paper, and I'll refer to that. I'll just give you a minute to pass those round. So the structure of the paper, and the talk will just follow the structure of the paper. The structure of the paper is in three sections. The first one, I try and talk a little bit about what do we mean by vocational education and training, sometimes called technical vocational education and training. The more you look at it, the more messy it gets. And it's often where we in universities don't bother to look. Then the second section is where I present data from the UK, Germany, Japan, Australia, and from Cisco, the global training company, which shows some issues about participation. And I try and ask questions. I'm not experts in all of these countries, so all I'm trying to do is ask questions about whether the local educational structures and cultures of different countries are producing differences or similarities in the participation of women and girls in vocational training. And then finally, I raised some questions about what might the causes be for gendering in this vocational area. Right, the thing about vocational education is it's hard to say what it is, except that whatever it is, it's always of a lower status than university. So that you can say it starts in its most informal state with children taking apprenticeships in the household by learning to do what their parents and elders do. That then becomes systematized in industrial countries, but it's always attached to an identity. So it's about learning to be somebody, not just learning to do something. It's about learning to be a carpenter, a farmer, a hairdresser, not just about learning to do certain sets of skills. Vocational education has more people with a stake in changing or influencing what happens in it. So we have trades union bodies engaged in trying to negotiate the curriculum of vocational education, employers, professional bodies, governments, accreditation bodies, educational systems. When I looked at Juliet's diagram, vocational education is kind of starts from before age 16. For some children, they start vocational education while they're still at school. Others then go into a parallel track different from their academic colleagues. In many countries, there are parallel systems post-school, some of which are totally about vocational qualifications. Some are sequential, so you can go from one and step up to universities. Formal vocational education only exists to a significant extent in industrialized countries. So if you look at vocational education in the developing world, it is that case of the boy learning to do what his father did or his elder relatives did, and the girl learning to do what her mother did or her elder female relatives did. I'm not going to look at that. That's nothing I know anything about. So I'm looking at industrialized countries. This is a figure that you need to look at in the paper. It's something that I've taken from a UNESCO document, and what it did, it's 2005, and it's a figure that looks at vocational education during the secondary school period, however long that is in whatever country you're looking at, and what proportion of secondary education is given to vocational education. And then in the paper you can see, but on the chart you can't very well, the two different lines are boys and girls. Now for me, looking at that, I expect a gender difference. They're all here. But I think these look quite little compared to the fact that in Ghana you've got 1 or 2% of secondary education engaged in vocational education, but up in Australia you've got over 40%. So for me, what's a surprise about this data is the huge difference across the world in the amount of secondary schooling that is recognised as formal vocational education. The problems in trying to look at vocational education, I think for us, if we start by thinking the more girls we get learning ICT in universities, vocational education, whatever level we look at, is that there is a problem with vocational education because it's always of lower status and lower value, both to the people who do it, to the people who teach it, and to governments who fund it, than universities are. And for instance, in the UK, a figure was quoted that something like 75% of post-school funding from the government is on full-time university students. The other 25% is on everything else. Part-time university students, vocational education, everything. So there's a phrase that comes up in the literature, universities for the best, trainings for the rest. And there is a sense in all vocational systems that it's where you send the children, or the children go who aren't good enough to make it to university. In some countries, and the US is often given as a good example of this, the educational system is structured so that you can go sequentially from a vocational local college up, if you keep on being successful, to a university, compared to, say, Germany, where you would take an academic track quite early, or a vocational track, and do your vocational through a Fachhochschule. But also what happens in Germany is that it's considered to be a European country that puts a lot of high status on traditional skilled work, compared to, say, the UK, in which traditional skilled work has very low status. So more VET in any country, more vocational education in a country might not be a good thing, because it might be because there aren't enough universities for people to go to. Or it might be that universities are too expensive or too selective. So we want to be aware of saying more vocational education is better. Vocational education programs are also traditionally used by European governments to reduce youth unemployment. It's also very associated with being a member of the working class, and if you like, choosing at 15 or 16 to make yourself a member of the working class. So it's associated with relatively low aspirations. It may also be that in some countries, for instance in much of sub-Saharan Africa, there isn't a lot of vocational education because or high level, because there aren't any jobs. So the amount of vocational education you have is related to your labour market. If there are no jobs, then nobody's going to bother to do any training for non-existent jobs. So I'm starting with the UK system. The UK system we've talked about already, to do with the academic qualifications. In parallel to academic qualifications in the UK system, there are things called national vocational qualifications, or because now we are no longer the UK, we are many independent countries, we also have Scottish vocational qualifications. That's what the S stands for. And what you can see here is that at this level, this vocational level, actually ICT, and what we did with this data is we've grouped whole ranges of different subjects into 6 main areas. These 3, and again, this is in the paper and you'll see it better. These are all kinds of information and communication technology subjects, engineering, manufacturing, construction and the built environment. And we were comparing them with the most popular vocational subjects for girls, which were business administration and law, where girls are up to 70% on these vocational qualifications, retail and commercial, where there is 69%, and health, public services and care work, where they're 87, 88%. But what to notice down here is for these vocational qualifications, in the UK, there aren't very many people, they're not very popular, but young women taking them are now, or made in 2007-8, 52% of people gaining some qualification in information and communication technology. We're not having that impact down here on the traditional set subjects where they reached 11% in engineering and roughly 2% in construction in the built environment. What I think most countries still have in Europe is also an apprenticeship system. And the difference between things like a vocational qualification in the UK and an apprenticeship system is to be an apprentice, you have to be employed. An employer takes you on as an apprentice, so the job almost predates the training. Whereas in a national vocational, you can do it while you're employed, or you can do it at college with a certain amount of release to employment. So for a lot of 16 to 18-year-olds, it's still quite a college-based qualification, or for a lot of older workers, it's something they do in their own time to upskill themselves. Apprentices are probably the most traditional model of vocational education that we have. In the UK, we don't have a lot of apprentices. It's not a popular system. But again, we grouped into the same sets of subjects. And this is information and communication technology at level 1 apprentice. And what we have there is that women were 23% of successful level 1 apprentices. So it's not great, and it's a lot less than the proportion that women were in the Vocational Qualifications Awards. But if we go on to the advanced apprentices, they've dropped out by now, and they're down to 18.5%. In the UK, employers argue constantly, and I'm sure it is in every country, that they don't get enough flow-through of trained workers. But they don't want to pay for these trained workers. Somebody else should. Now, what we have here is a list of IT occupations and the percentage in the UK and the percentage of each occupation by gender that has a qualification up to university level. So that's with a level 4 or 5 qualification is some kind of university diploma or degree. And what we can see is that at the moment in the UK employment market, only 65% of ICT managers have that level of qualification of any kind. But it's very similar for men and for women. The same at the next level. In fact, a higher proportion of IT women professionals, very, very slightly, I don't think it's significant, are qualified than men. But we've still there got 35% of IT professionals in the UK have no education up to degree level. When you come to software professionals, here's a real difference. 72% of male software professionals have a degree level qualification, but less than 60% of women software professionals. But then it gets similar down here until database assistants and women are slightly more qualified than men. I mean, that says to me something like either there's a real gap in the British market and those qualifications are needed, or actually employers are quite happy to pay less and employ people who aren't so well qualified because they can do the job anyway. Now, I've taken some figures from Germany, and this comes from a German trades union publication about the equivalent of qualifications in Germany to apprentices in the UK. Now, you'll find that, I'm flipping through, on page 20. I think that's the wrong one. So ignore that and look. I thought that looks littler than the one that's in the paper. This is me doing quick cut and pastes very unsuccessfully. If you look at the one in the paper, which is the accurate one, what that is a list of all categories of apprenticeship, vocational education and training in Germany and the proportion of men and women in each of those. What you see in Germany, and this is where I think it's important to do this looking at the context, is that information technology specialists are less than 10% women. What we saw in Britain was a much higher proportion of women engaged in training in ICTs, both in school, in vocational training, even in apprenticeships. In Germany, it's really low, and it's tiny down at kind of electronics technicians. But one of the interesting things about this German data, and a colleague helped do the translation, is that I came across something called Management Assistant for Office Communication. And I said to my colleague, do I call this person a clerical worker? And she said, oh no, we've changed the title actually in Germany to reflect the fact that this is now a technical occupation. It's an ICT occupation, and it has changed. It isn't called or known as a clerical worker anymore. So part of my thinking with this is also spurring this thing to think about, are we getting too rigid in what we understand and name as ICT jobs? And is that doing a disservice to women? So you can look at those in your leisure, the right ones. I think now I've got the right one for Japan on the right page. Japan has a very binary system, as I understand it, with a set of vocational colleges post-school called Senmengakai. I'm sure that isn't how it's pronounced. I envisage them as being equivalent to kind of German Fachhochschulen. And these are the qualifications only in ICT areas, most recently for students coming out of those colleges. And what's interesting there again is some very broad area called information communication has 75% of students on that vocational route are women, whereas you drop right down to communication network engineering for it to be about 10. So again, there's some different categorization of what that training is, not that work, but that training. These are people on training programs, vocational training programs in Japan. The next next and final country is Australia. Oh, sorry, I've gone one too far. This is Australia. And these are vocational training programs in Australia. And Australia has a system with vocational colleges, post-school vocational colleges. And on these vocational colleges, you can, in a bit like the UK system, or the US system, you could do well and then go on to university, or you could stop with your vocational qualifications. So what we see here is that information technology is recruiting better than agriculture and environmental sciences. So in Australia, we have nearly 30% of people on vocational programs in information technology are female. The engineering technologies in which I think some of what we might think of as hard computing might be in there, but if you label it as information and communication information technology, you get a good turnout. I went and thought, when you look at vocational education, you look at state provision, but you also need to look at employer provision. And in the case of ICT, you need to look at global training provision. And the two major global providers for ICT training are Microsoft and Cisco. And Microsoft and Cisco deliver training with partners throughout the world. And both Microsoft and Cisco on their websites have lots of lovely stuff about promoting women in the industry and on training. I can't find anywhere on any of the websites anything about how many of their trainees are women. I can't find who to ask. I try phoning up Cisco and I'm told they have a policy of no referring your phone calls and no giving out any extension numbers. So I thought, what's the point in answering the phone then? Because I said, could I speak to your marketing manager or your research manager? No, we don't pass on your calls. So what my colleague Clem suggested was at our university, we deliver some Cisco training courses in partnership with them. They're Cisco qualifications. And in our distance teaching university, what we have is 6.6% of students, 500 of them last year, doing Cisco networking qualification with us were women. It's really tiny. It's really, at this point, dropped back to those tiny, less than 10% women. I'm not sure what some of these qualifications mean, advancing routing, but only 6% of people qualifying were women. And wide area networks, 5.2% were women and 6% were women. The interesting thing about this is that women actually, once on these courses, were performing better than men, which is unusual for most of the courses in this area. So I'm left with two questions with that data. I think the present state of vocational training is actually problematic for us. And actually, is it possible to make it a better preparation for women to get good employment? In the UK, if a young woman was to come to me and say, what should I do? I'm interested in doing more ICT. I'm interested in a job in the area. I'd say go to university. I wouldn't say find an apprenticeship. She's likely to be much more successful if she goes to university than she is if she starts an apprenticeship, given the kind of figures of completion. Also, can ICT vocational training actually be a challenge to the gendering of ICT skills and work? Or is it somehow so owned by employers and a traditional system that actually it's the hardest place to do any challenges in? So I'm going to finish with some questions that I was left with. I think there's no way of looking at vocational training initiatives without also looking at any other parallel academic initiatives within the local area that you're working in. You need to do both together, and I would suggest that those of us who also work on university stuff for part of the time also look at the impact our emphasis on university education is having on the status and the funding for vocational education. Actually, in many countries, it's questionable how much these two are separate, but they're still separate in the literature. They're still often separate in different institutions, and they're certainly funded quite separately. One of the big things that comes out of this is an association with working class masculinity. The phrase in some of the English literature for apprenticeships is that these were for the lads of the dads. So they are employer-based, and traditionally employers employ family members. So they take on the sons of their male employees to train them, or the daughters of their female employees to train them in gender-appropriate jobs. Is it possible to break that? Is it something that we have to wait for changes in what constitutes masculinity, or should we in fact be looking at, can ICT produce new forms of gendered femininity and masculinity? Graduate women, when they enter the workforce, because they're graduates, actually have been told they have the authority to challenge. They've been trained in abstract reasoning. That's what a university degree gives you. That's what it's meant to be for. So you come into the workforce and at least you're a graduate, even if you're an inexperienced graduate. An apprentice has no authority to challenge anything. An apprentice is not being trained in abstract thinking. In the literature, that's often the distinction between vocational training and academic training, is vocational training is procedural. It's about training somebody to do something and may not contain any training on how to think about doing something. That's what you get as a graduate. So apprentices and the people that we send in from vocational routes are not equipped to actually challenge the gendering of the organisation they enter. We haven't equipped them to do that. Also, what's happening, it seems to me, in the ICT fields I looked at and in different countries, how hard and soft ICT skills are being defined and then grouped inside training subjects is different, and it's having an impact on the proportions of men and women in them. So how we actually, not to take these things as already defined for us, but to see this as a new area in which you can redefine and filter out and change and multidiscipline certain areas. And maybe we should be actually doing some of that, because it does look like being left to itself, it's going to really fall into the hard area with no women in it and the soft area with no men in it. Then the question comes back actually to the role of employers in vocational training. I mean, what are they willing to pay for? The literature suggests that women are a decreasing proportion of ICT hard skills type jobs. Women also in the literature love training. So all the literature suggests women are always off training, but the economic returns on women's training, no matter what jobs they're involved in the training for, are less than the returns that men get on their training. So employers talk a lot about valuing training, but they're paying men more who have less training than they're paying the women who have more training. So there's something in there I think we need to poke at. So to me, I just want to leave you with this is how I felt at the end of doing this kind of overview is ICT vocational training is nothing if not a challenge to those involved in women's education. Thank you.